So then from about 1957 onwards,
Yeah.
you often talk about a number of different events that happened from there on up to around 1990. Can we just talk a bit about those events? Or
What sort of events are we looking at?
well, you mentioned something about Sweden.
Oh, yes. I was trying to think of how to cover what influenced me. And remember that years were passing and people were asking me to take on, be like the head of the mining department. And then a long time later, we combined the departments and they said, would you take and be head of the civil department? But I think I told you, maybe I've said it already, soon after I arrived here and I set up my drilling research thing, and a professor from Sweden, the mining professor from the Royal Institute in Stockholm, just visited the department and he looked at my setup and he said, you know, I really think you should go and talk with Dr. Hans Christian Fischer. He's a professor of physics at Uppsala University. He said, I can't say anything about it because his work is classified. He's doing it for Atlas Copco. So I said, oh, okay. So didn't think much more about it, but later on, I can't go into all the details, but I went to Sweden and I went to see Hans Christian. And it was true. He was doing a little more analytical work, but we were doing very similar things. And we became very good friends because we exchanged ideas later. He came back over and he actually stayed up at the cabin. Got along with us fine. But and while I was there, I got to know this man called Sten Bergman. And Sten was the top applied rock mechanics person in Sweden. And as I've said before, the Stockholm region is, and a lot of Scandinavia is built on really high quality granite. And they were neutral, but they were concerned about the potential for nuclear warfare between the United States. It was the Cold War era, and yet Sweden here, Russia here, US here, and if you draw a line between it, it goes right through Scandinavia. And they thought we'd get involved either with fallout or something. So they developed all kinds of preparation to avoid any consequences from nuclear weapons. And they built all of their oil reserves. They had 14 months supply, I think it was, of oil reserves in deep underground caverns. They built the metros, expanded the metros. They built concert halls. And later in Norway, in Lillehammer, the Winter Olympics was in the world's largest cavern, 60 meters, 200 feet, free span across in rock. And they were doing all of that. And it was just showing what I'd said about the AIME earlier and developing the Underground Construction Research Council. They were doing what we were talking about could be done and could save money. And it just blew me away. So I got very involved with them and later on. So that's Sweden for a variety of reasons. Later on, Magnus Bergman, the son of the first man, came to help ITASCA.
Tell us a little bit about how the U.S. influenced your career. For example, in 1957, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences published the report, The Disposal of Radioactive Waste on Land. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes. As you know, one of the developments of World War II was the atomic bomb, but then also one got to peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and nuclear power was considered to be very major development. But one of the problems was what do you do with this radioactive waste, because it remained dangerously radioactive for thousands, and in many cases over 100,000 years. So how do you avoid it having a negative influence, the waste from those power plants having a negative influence on the population? Well, again, the underground was considered the best option to separate these things that are decaying from the biosphere, the living. And so the Academy recommended that, and that led to a number of experiments. The nuclear power plant in Savannah River, Georgia, there was a notion to put the waste in actually liquid form down under the nuclear power plant there. And at the time, Jimmy Carter was the governor of Georgia, and he was an engineer. And he said, because he said there could be a mistake and some of that waste could get into the groundwater and contaminate it and so on. But the argument he did use to get it stopped said, well, what if there was an earthquake while you were pumping it down? We said the chances of that, we can isolate a thing. You're just at getting around to blasting blasting astronauts off in a capsule, so you can shock isolate very wisely. So they were looking at ways to stop it, and they did stop it. But that led to the National Academy of Sciences research group to establish what they call the Board of Radioactive Waste Management. And that started to look at every option, as well as putting it underground on land, shooting the waste up into a solar orbit so it would go back to where it came from, I mean, the sun, putting on an island where the wind is never below 120 miles an hour, and so nobody would, all kinds of things. And eventually came back to put it underground. So there was a lot of reactors in the US. They said, where do we do it? So there's a national search, and Minnesota was considered to be a good group because they had granite up around St. Cloud. So every state was looked at to see where should it go, which were candidates. And it's kind of funny to look at how every group developmental, how do we make sure that it doesn't come here? And so Minnesotans went very big on the fact that this radioactive waste would be right next to the biggest freshwater repository in the world, Lake Superior. So that you don't put it in Minnesota, it's too close to Lake. So every state fought to avoid having it. And eventually it came down to Yucca Mountain in Nevada. And I was involved very much with the Board of Radioactive Waste Management. Then we had another set of radioactive waste from Los Alamos lab. It was the kind of low-level waste. People who had gloves that they'd thrown in, you wear a glove to protect yourself and then throw it out. All of that low-level contaminated stuff, where to put that. So there was a proposal to put that in Carlsbad, New Mexico, with what they call the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. So I got to be involved chairing various groups, and that we went from the US sometimes. After the Chernobyl accident, a group of us went to Russia to check with Russian colleagues whether there was any possibility the same nuclear plants that were in Chernobyl were, for example, right outside what was called Leningrad then. And they were doing some fascinating things. They were putting the nuclear plants right next to big cities because the waste heat that you see going up, they were using that to heat the homes around Leningrad. So there was a lot of discussions. What should we learn from that disaster and so on? So the Board of Radioactive Waste occupied a lot of my time. I was still trying to do drilling, rock mechanics research, people asking me to be head of department or whatever. Fortunately, as time was moving forward, I was able to add 1 or 2 people to the rock mechanics staff, so I wasn't the only one teaching the courses. Tony Starfield came along and so on. So that was how I tried to move forward, and then I got involved with the National Academy of Science. I got elected to the Academy, and the similar things there.
So talk a bit about the long-standing, very close relationship with France throughout your career.
Oh, yeah. Well, as I said, I was, when I was a high school student, I developed an appreciation for learning French. And I had a very tough French teacher. And I could actually pull it out of a drawer here somewhere and show it to you. But every 3 times a year, we got a report card. It was a book, and it listed where you stood in the class. And another one was, what was your standing in the class? Were you top of the class, second, third? And the other one was the teacher's evaluation. Did she give you an A, B, C, D, or what? And the French teacher, one time, the class was about 35 students. And I got the report card and had to take it home. My parents had to sign it before it could go back to show that they'd seen it. And it said, for French, ranking in the class, 1. I was the top of 35 students. And the grade at that time was called VF, very fair. That was like a D. And I said, what are you trying to I said, I'm the top of the class and you give me a D. She said, look, everybody will know from the first one that you were the top of the class. The second one is my evaluation of how much effort you put in compared to your potential. That's why we have 2 ratings. She said, I don't think you worked very hard for that. You didn't deserve anything higher. So that was, and I actually eventually got to really appreciate her because she was tough, but that's why I took French all the time. So I always had this pleasant, and secondly, the French, ever since Napoleon, had a high commitment to higher education and very top quality education. When I said about students coming from other places, the French students that came to Minnesota always were prepared very, very well from places like what they call the Grandes Écoles, École Polytechnique, the Civil Engineering Lab, Ponts et Chaussées, and others. So since we could speak a bit of French, I went over there a while. We took sabbaticals there, and I got to know the top rock mechanics people, Pierre Land, and eventually you spent a year with him and learned French, and he referred to you as my other daughter, so on. So I had a very pleasant relationship with them. I like to have a dialogue and discussions with them because they were at the forefront of some of the questions that had this Malpasset dam fail, and they always felt it was a blot on the, engineers. And it was a while later that going back to the various nuclear powers, the US, China, Britain, France, and who I left out. Anyway, the ones that had nuclear weapons all agreed to a comprehensive test ban treaty, which meant no more testing of nuclear weapons. And the US, no, anyway, all of the countries except France signed it. And the French said they wished to conduct an additional series of tests in the South Pacific and that they would like the time to do that. And once they'd finished that, it would be the end of their testing. Well, that provoked a major uproar around the world. And that's when, you know, the Congress said they weren't going to eat French fries anymore. They're going to call freedom fries and stuff like that. And the Australians said that if they conducted their tests, any radionuclides that sneaked into the water would go past Australia and maybe New Zealand and down there. So they were up in arms and protesting. And so that was going on for about 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And I got a telephone call. I think it was in this house. And it was from Pierre Berest. He was one of the younger ones. Now, Pierre Berest, on the side, was also a big rugby fan. And he liked to travel around the British Isles and France to follow the rugby. And I got this call, and he said, "Charles, I have to tell you, I'm in the middle of Ireland. I'm in a coin box, and I'm running out of, you know, coins. I want to talk to you. Will you be willing to form and lead an international group on behalf of the President of France?" It was a request from, I'm trying to think of the president's name at the time. But,
Chirac.
Chirac, Jacques Chirac. He said, would you be willing to do that? Because we want to have you go to the place they're doing the tests down in the South Pacific and evaluate it when we've completed the tests. And he said, what we'll do, we'll give you $1 million, which was a bit of money at the time, and then we won't have any more involvement. You will form your own international committee, and we will, it was the French army really that would control, you know, military control. We will help you go down there and so on. Anyway. And he said, I need an answer quickly because I'm running out of coins. And he said, there's a few people knocking on that say there's not many coins. So I said, well, yes, but I'll do it, but you'll have to come and get more details. Well, that started a 3-year study, which was the finest, you know, research enterprise we'd done, because we were able to get Frenchmen, Australians, English, Russian, the top people around the world. And what was nice about the French is that they insist that when you do a job like that, that you travel first class. You know, none of this economy class. And so I said, he said, but it's up to you. And so I said, well, to all of the people I invited, look, you have one first-class ticket, but if you make the choice to take and bring your wife or girlfriend or whatever, as long as you don't go over the price of the first-class ticket, we'll pay for it. Because the French said it's... So we had a guy from Cambridge. He brought his wife. We were in Tahiti, and we then flew down. The men, they were leanly all the men, flew down to the testing grounds, and the women stayed back and had a lot of fun in Tahiti for a while. So it was a wonderful meeting. The first meeting was in King's College, Cambridge, And it was held in the house, which was a bigger house than this, of the English person on the committee, Anthony Pearson. We paid them for being able to stay for 2 or 3 days. And I was walking down the street after we'd listened to a recital by the King's College Choir at night. And Guillaume de Marcilly, who was a leading French hydrologist and a world hydrologist, he went there down the street and he came alongside me, and he'd had polio, but he'd recovered most of it, but he was still a little limp. And he said, "Charles, would you mind if the next meeting is held in France? I'd like to." And he said he had a somewhat run-down chateau that he'd inherited from his family in the south of France. He said, "We can have the meeting there." Well, we did, and it was a remarkable meeting, but it developed this little bit of national pride. Where's the next one going to be? Anyway, and then we had, so and then we did a report, and it was in English and French. It took us 3 years, and we submitted it to the French. And then I was working on another group with the French to look at their radioactive waste facility, which was up near the champagne fields, and there was a big concern that with all the champagne sales in the world. Anyway, all that was going on associated with these meetings. That was in France. And of course, as you know, that eventually led to one of the biggest surprises of my life, when a few years later, I got a note to say that I'd been elected to the French Légion d'honneur. And it was interesting because 2 or 3 of the French people I knew were in the Légion d'honneur, but they were at the level of chevalier, which is the first one. And they nominated me for a higher level, which was higher than they had. And that's the kind of people I was meeting. So you remember you went to that meeting, and I was given the medal by the president of the French Physics Society in a really nice facility in Paris. And he talked about the various things that I had done with France. I was on the scientific advisory committee for 10 years for finding their waste facility, and so on. But he said he examined that report, and he said it was a more scientifically rigorous and high-level report that one of the few he had seen. Now, I didn't put it together, everybody did, but it was a very nice conclusion. And the interesting thing is then the French just quickly signed that thing, and all of this uproar disappeared. So that's and there's lots of others. As you know, you went for a year to school, you went over there and studied and got a PhD there. So the relationship with French was very tight. And your mother taught French, of course.
So continuing around the world,
Yeah.
we're moving over to Brazil, and you have some
Oh, yeah.
some experience and stories from Brazil.
I'll tell you, yes, Brazil is a very interesting story. Well, to me, it's interesting. I was in my office one day, and there was a knock on the door. And I think I had 2 offices because I was a department head, and then that's where I signed papers and stuff. And then I had another office where I could get some work and talk to students. And this knock came on the door. This person came in. There's a gentleman. He was about 15 years older than I was. And he told me that his name was Figueiredo, and that he had taken a geology degree at the University of Minnesota, but he was from Brazil, and that he'd met and married his well, his wife, who was a Minnesota nursing graduate, and he was coming back just to meet relatives and so on. And I don't know why he came across to me. Initially, I didn't know why. And so he said he was wondering that he was with the Petrobras, the big drilling company of Brazil. And he said, during our drilling for oil, we've encountered this big potash deposit, and we were thinking it might be economic to mine. And he said, since you're a mining engineer, I was wondering if you might be interested to give us some advice. And he was talking it very low key all the time. And then I said, well, yes, I would. Well, it developed. I went down to Brazil and said, yes, I think that it looks like it could be a good economic proposition. And I said, so, I said, it's going to take a while to do. So I said, what would be a good idea, since I'm at the university, is if I could put a student on it for a PhD thesis to help develop it. And he said, well, that would be okay, but if you do, we would like it to be a Brazilian student, and we would like to choose him. We'll send him up here to work with you, but we would choose him. And he said, and when he finished his thesis, he would have to submit it to the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. I know these were funny requirements, but that's okay. He's paying for it. And I don't have the responsibility to get him the PhD. Well, anyway, it turned out to be a very interesting project, and I made many trips down there. And as you know, I brought you back little gemstones and stuff. Because anyway, so at the end, this student, Alvaro Maya da Costa, and he just got married. You remember, Charles, he was in the Jaguar outside. Mm. But his wife was with him, and she was a mathematics teacher. And she taught mathematics at I think it was the Marine, essentially West Point of Brazil, Academy for Military, I think it was Marines. And she said, I'm the only woman teacher in the academy. She said, and it's so nice to go in the morning to teach class, and they all stand up and salute me. She said, there's the only woman teacher in there. But she was a lovely woman. Anyway, they came up and took the courses. He finished his PhD. And a few years later, we had a meeting. There was one Brazilian man who was elected to the National Academy of Engineering for having discovered a major oil deposit off the coast of Brazil. I think it was called the Salinas deposit or something. But it was a very difficult deposit because it had, I think it was over 1,000 meters or 3,000 feet or more of salt above it. And as you know, under pressure, salt flows and so on. And so this man who was coming, and he was an international member of the Academy, and I said to him, I wonder if you know Mr. Alvaro Maya da Costa. And his face lit up, and he said, know him? If it had, was my technical director, and if it hadn't been for him, we could not have drilled through that salt. So that's like an end story to a student who went out. So that was Brazil.
You also have spent a time as the president of the International Society for Rock Mechanics. Can you talk a bit about that time frame of your life?
Yeah, that, of course, brought me into contact with people in many other countries I think one of the first places I went down to was Chile, and it was during the transition from a very repressive regime to something else, but we won't get into that. But I learned about because Chile is the biggest copper producer in the world. And I got to know a bit about their expertise and so on. And then I went to India, had a lot of fascinating, but bit back to India, I even, although I was also associated for a while with at the time it was East and West Germany, and the East Germans had a parallel organization, so I had to go through Checkpoint Charlie quite a few times in Berlin, and so I just learned an awful lot about the fact that there were first-rate people in just about every country in the world. And it taught me, the headquarters of the ISRM were in Lisbon, so got to know a lot about Portugal, but it was a very broadening and widening experience.
Maybe backing up a bit, talk a bit about when you were the head of the School of Mineral and Metallurgical Engineering earlier on.
Do you want me to take into account when they closed the program?
Yeah, you did talk about that.
Yeah.
Before.
Yeah, well, with the School of Mines and Metallurgy, or Mineral and Metallurgy, it was given various titles from time to time. And we had a persistent problem. It was kind of interesting. The mining companies up north, this gentleman, Professor Fleider, I told you about, had graduated from the university, and many of the people who were in charge of the mines had graduated with him. And so he would frequently go up there trying to get funding for them to help develop research programs and so on. But they would never give him anything for research. They would say, we are paying so much in taxes, go back to the Minnesota government and ask them for the research money. We're paying enough already. But he was always able to get funding for scholarships for students. And so we always had plenty of money to give to students, but for some reason we could never attract enough students to come into the program. And even though everyone we told will pay your way through, they wouldn't, no. And we'd go on special bursts and want the employment I got, but then it would go down. So a lot of things were going on. The state of the University of Minnesota was very anxious to develop graduate programs and be in the forefront of research. And we had the mines and metallurgy was process metallurgy, that's refining it. And the other one was really what they call physical metallurgy, and that was really getting to the high alloy strengths and refining very carefully. And they felt that they wanted to be closer to the chemical engineering people rather than attract to us who were just digging it out of the ground. Anyway, it ended up with separating the School of Mines into an affiliation with civil engineering, and it was renamed the Civil and Mineral Engineering Department. We kept the degree programs, but they moved around, and they affiliated with the chemical engineering and became chemical engineering and material science. Well, that went on for a while, and I was head of the mining and department, and just as when they combined the two departments, I was no longer civil engineering was a bigger department. Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped the gun a little bit. We were operating as the School of School of Mineral and some other name anyway. And then they decided to put us together with civil, and the other people, as I said, with chemical engineering. And when it merged, I felt very happy because they had a civil engineering department head, and it's a much bigger department than mine, so I felt I could get back into dealing with students and research. And then I went on leave for a while, and when I came back, I found out that the head of the civil engineering department had been invited to step down. He was an excellent engineer, but didn't have apparently the administrative skills that they wanted. And then they came to me and asked me to take over the group. And I was very upset at the time because I said, I just finished doing a lot and I want to get more involved in the research. But anyway, I finally conceded, and so we had, I was head of the Civil and Mineral Department, and just after we had merged those two, there were some what they call coordinate campuses around Minnesota, and one of them was in Duluth. And they had a geology department, and the head of the geology department was a chief geologist for U.S. Steel before he came to the university. He was a mining geologist, in other words. And the head of the provost of the university, that's like the president of that Duluth campus, was also a geologist, Bob Heller, very distinguished one. And there was another third person who was the dean of the geology group, I think, and that was they gave him the nickname Rip Rap, and he was a archaeological geologist. He would look at the geology of. Anyway, they three came down to the university and said, "Look, you're having all this trouble with getting students for the mining program. Why don't you think about transferring the mining undergraduate degree? You can keep the graduate programs to the University of Minnesota Duluth." They said, we're close to the Iron Range and so on, and we think that we're a smaller college. We'll have a better chance of attracting students into the mining program than you have. Well, Flyda was in there with me and others, and eventually we agreed with some reluctance, but said, okay, and while you're getting going, we were going to go up twice a week and teach courses until they got their own people. Then they said, so we'll have to apply to the Board of Regents for permission to give engineering degrees, because at the time, nobody else but the big campus could give professional degrees. You couldn't have a medical school, you couldn't have a law school, you couldn't have engineering. So we said, okay, we'll wait till you make an application to the Board of Regents. And so they applied for permission to grant engineering degrees up there. Mm-hmm. And the Board of Regents said, yes, okay. So they said, great, we're all set. And then the Chamber of Commerce for University of Minnesota Duluth went to the University of Duluth and said, hey, if you want to improve the economy of Duluth, absolutely, engineering degrees will help, but mining is not the one that's going to do it for us. We want computer science, we want mechanical, we want electrical, so on. Yeah. We had agreed to terminate the program here, Twin Cities, and suddenly they had been told that you're better off to get degrees in these other programs. And right now, that was in, what was it, 1983? 82 or 83. There's the college, Swanson College of Engineering, up in Duluth, and it has degrees in about every engineering discipline you can think of, except mining. And so we lost mining here, and I would go to SME meetings, and they said, we feel alumni would say, "We feel betrayed." I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "Well, we were alumni of the School of Mines at University of Minnesota, and we felt proud of it." He said, "Now when you go to SME meetings, there is no booth. There's nothing for us. It's called, as you know now, Friends of Minnesota."
Yeah.
And so I got sort of blamed for depriving them of a part of their existence.
So in 1981 then, you started ITASCA Consulting Group,
I am.
emphasizing applied R&D for mining and civil engineering.
Right, right.
Today is now recognized internationally in mining and civil engineering consulting, not the action of someone abandoning mining.
No, I'm glad you made that point, because that was it. We had been developing for, what was it? Anyway, since I came from 1956 to 1981, because I was finding it frustrating, there was nobody pushing what I consider was essential R&D for mining. And so we put together the consulting company, and I mentioned this Peter Cundall, whom I'd met as a graduate student in London and managed to get him to come over here. And he was going gangbusters. I mean, his developments were really showing that they were paying off. And I had Magnus Bergman and everything they'd done with underground space there. And I thought that between us, we could put a good consulting company together. And as I think, it's on that separate tape that you have the whole story of how we did it, how we got them going. But by 1981, we just graduated the 20th PhD. And right now, if you look in the records, although they changed the term now to geological and something engineering, but it's all rock mechanics is in there, we have got just about 120 PhDs that could work in the mining industry. They don't all work in the mining industry, they work other places, but I'm saying we have made a contribution to where I think mining engineering should be going, is having real R&D competent people. And one of them that I have mentioned to many, and I shouldn't mention one because there's so many, but as you know, Mark Boyd he's gone. It took me 17 years to convince him to finish a PhD, but he did it. And he's just a great, great guy, top flight engineer.
So you talk a bit about
Practical engineer.
You talked a bit about the U.S. and minerals, critical minerals, et cetera, in the U.S. And
Yes.
you made the comment that it's been neglected for almost 60 years. Do you want to share some thoughts about that?
Yeah. I could go back. I think if you look on Wikipedia, you'll find a thing called Kissinger Report. And I think it was in 1972 or so. Henry Kissinger was behind a report which was talking about threats to the United States. And you'll see on there, the number one in the listing it just says, the U.S. will be heavily dependent on minerals from developing countries, which will grow, and continue to grow into the future. We need to do something about this. I could go into more. There's more details to that report, but that was what I thought was the first indication of that. And then I could give you chapter and verse, but 1980, something was the first report of the National Academies on critical minerals. The term was defined then and saying, what is a critical mineral? And it's something that is essential to the well-being for example, economic well-being of the United States, and national security. Now, what's national security? The U.S. was always priding itself on being in the forefront of military technology, but they were beginning to realize that a number of the minerals that were required, like rare earths and other things, were coming from other countries. And that has just grown and grown and grown. And right now, I think the 2022 report of the U.S. Geological Survey lists like, what is it? It was 35, about 40, or is it more? No, it's more than that. Anyway, a huge host of minerals. And you can see the list. And for something like 20 odd of them, it's 100% imported. And for the others, it's 50% or so imported. And various administrations, the Trump administration passed some legislation, the Biden administration, but then recently the Biden administration says, no, didn't quite say we're not too worried, but they said we are going to try to talk to our friends of Canada and Australia to help us. And in the meantime, China has been all over the developing world agreeing to help develop their mines and so on, with a proviso that they will allow them to be refined in China. So even though they're not mined in China, China will have the minerals in the form that everybody else in the world will want. So they're in the driver's seat. And I think it was in, what was it? Oh, there was an argument between Japan and China over a fishing boat. And it ended up with saying that the Chinese was going to deny sending rare earths to Japan. And that created a panic for a while, and it sailed down. But that potential exists. You know, if the U.S., well, and the Biden administration knows it. And right now, China is the biggest place we import from. The second most is Canada. To me, Australia, if we try to get them to give us favored nation status, they will not send as many minerals to the Middle East, to the Far East. Mm-hmm. China will move in on there. So it's not getting the minerals from Australia, to me, doesn't make sense. Getting from China, but Canada's already doing that. Right now, people are making a lot about lithium and other things for electric vehicles, you know. But when you get to a list that's as long as the list of the US, all mining needs to be, concern. Now, there was a friend of mine, he was the Home Secretary of the National Academy of Science, National Academy of Engineering. He's retired now. But he constantly said to me, remember, Charles, knowledge is power. And his idea was, if the US stays in the front of technology, other countries will want to come to us because we'll be ahead of the game. We may not have the minerals, but if we say we have the technology to develop those minerals in a way that is ahead of other countries, then we have a chance that they will be wanting to do business with us. So I don't see any option, really, for competing with China on minerals, except on technology. And a lot of people, I've been to the US where we have trouble getting 10 or 15 students in a room. I've been to China where it's a standing only crowd of 200, 300 students, all mining students, waiting to hear what you have to say. And yet, most of those Chinese students that got ahead were developed, educated in this country. And I think it's a good thing. And I have nothing at all against China. I love the industrious and so on. But the question is, do we have to deal with the American economy and keeping Americans employed and so on? Now, as you know, the reality is that you're not going to employ many people in the mining industry. Currently, as you know, there's less than 0.1% of the US workforce works in the mining industry. And over half of that so-called mining industry is the construction materials industry, the quarries and so on. So the number right now, and if you look at what mining engineers advertise as the way of the world, they're showing you mines which have virtually no people in them. So what's happening now is you're getting mines with almost nobody in them. But technology is running them. They're running from, and I think that we sell ourselves short. The US graduate schools, research schools, are first rate, the graduate school. There's this bill that's just going before Senate now, the Manchin, somebody else bill. It's a Republican from, I think it's
Barrasso.
Barrasso. It's Barrasso-Manchin bill. And they're talking about giving money to get mining schools going back again. Well, you've got to be careful. Those are nearly all the Colorado School of Mines, there's Penn State, West Virginia, Arizona. There's 3 or 4 who are PhD granting institutions and are very good. But there are a lot of them that are small schools that don't give anything above a master's degree. And they're talking about, there were some early things in SME, SI exchanges. Oh, well, it's good to give some of that money, get the money and give it to the small schools. Be careful. What is it you want to get out of that? What the National Science Foundation does is say, we'll put $5 million a year into an engineering research center for 5 to 10 years. And at the end of that 10 years, the group that's done that is able to go off and form their own company and lead the way. So you can, but they have provisos in there that talk about how to bring along disadvantaged schools. Well, you can do that for the small schools as well. For example, it's not only R&D you need, it's professional master's programs of taking an engineer and saying, how do you get to know enough about research so that you can go and work at a mine and talk to the people about your problems who are in research. Develop a linkage between those who speak the language of research, but 2 miners, those who do the research, and they can come from any discipline. You know, what we need now, like at ITASCA, I don't know how many are mining engineers, very few. There are every grade of engineer, but they're all developing computer programs and so on. Mm-hmm. But so there needs to be a great deal of thought. I'm delighted that they're getting that money. But as when I was looking back at some of the legislation to try to get policies for minerals in the United States, I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw that this is a bit of a digression. But when the Cuban oil crisis, not Cuban oil, Cuban Missile Crisis came, and they were concerned that missiles would be hitting Washington, D.C., and a group of the Senate from the State Department said we've got to find a way to build tunnels very much faster, 10 times faster than we can now, to get the president and others into bunkers below Washington, D.C. They have them now, but I'm talking about 1960s. And so they, just in 1964, the National Academy of Engineering was just being founded, and one of the standing committees that they established was the Standing Committee on Rapid Excavation. And you wonder about that because it ended up leading to things like the RETC conference, Rapid Excavation and Tunneling Conference, and it's gone on and on. But the whole idea was to make a quantum jump in how fast you can excavate tunnels. That has not happened. Now, a lot of very good work. For example, you can go through tunnels now, have tunnels now that go through very bad ground where there's water seeping in and you get through it. You could never do that before. But as far as speed is concerned, they haven't done it. Now, there were, what's his name? I'm trying to think. Peterson. Carl Peterson. He was a mechanical engineer at MIT. The fellow who's the AUA, no, the American Rock Mechanics, so Peter Smealy, Dick Robbins, who leads the Robbins thing. We were in all together in what we call NADET, the National Association for Drilling and Excavation Technology. And Carl Peterson was leading it. After about 3 or 4 years, you can ask, went out of business. We couldn't get a nickel from anybody in the industry to do R&D. You know, so that's why I'm saying that. And then I started looking at previous efforts, and lo and behold, and I've now copied it, and it's on the Fairhurst files thing. Flyder was the first chairman, the man who hired me was the first chairman of the Rapid Excavation Committee for the National Academies. And he went before a Minerals Hearing Committee and said that what they needed over and above the money that was available, because that included the Bureau of Mines and others, an amount of money. Do you have the number there somewhere? It's amazing. Flyder, how much he said, it was billions. It was
150 million a year for 10 years.
Right. That's what he said was needed.
1966.
1966. Now think of how many years ago that is.
So it was sorry, Dad, just to correct. It was 200 million for 10 years and equivalent to 1.5 billion or 150 million a year for 10 years in 2022.
Yeah, because he was proposing a 10-year program, and it was to make underground mining more efficient so that there'd be less need for surface mining engineering. And as surface mining engineering got to the limit of what they could do, they would be ready with much better underground mining techniques. Now, that's 1966. If you look at the Manchin bill, they don't even say what they're going to do with the money, but it's less than about, I don't know, a tenth of that. Mm. So that was the thinking then.
Following on from what you've said, and you've probably already answered it, what's one key message you'd like to share about what you've learned over your 75-year career?
You want me to talk about mining? I've learned a lot of things. But I'd like to say it about mining because I came from a mining background. And as I've said, that with all of the shortcomings, there's not a finer bunch of people in the world that I would ever like to have been associated with than miners. and I don't care whether they're Greek miners or Irish miners or whatever, they experience difficult underground, difficult conditions day by day, and they're rough-spoken and so on. But when the chips are down, you can rely on them to help. They face tough situations, and they do it without a need for applause or recognition. So as far as that part of the career, I have always met first-rate people dealing with mining. What do you want to know? What would I want to do? What I would love to see, and as I think I said before, at the 2015 Denver SME conference, the moderator, who was Peter Bryant, who then formed, he said, he was to start, mining is broken, we need a new template. And he's formed the Development Partner Institute for Mining, together with the CEO of Anglo-American, Mark Cutifani, who is saying that the industry absolutely needs R&D. But we owe it to miners. There are a lot better ways to do things. And the interesting thing is, how are you going to justify to a place opening up a mine if you tell them, well, no, there's not going to be many people working there? To be honest, there's not. It is, how are you going to get them to process, to find out where you can make the money and make big for a community? And it's going to be probably in the processing. It's going to be in the other. So we've got to think.
The support you get around your career has largely, in the last 10 years or so, probably come from your children doing our best, and there's 7 of us, you know, getting you to the airport, getting you things dry cleaned, helping you out wherever we can. But before that point, there was our mother, and she's still alive, but not as able to help. And I wanted you, because at every talk I've ever seen you give, and I'm certain Charles has seen the same thing, you always mention mother.
And you recognize her support.
Recognize her support. And I think,
So
I just wanted you to talk a bit about that.
yeah. As you know, your mother's quite a wonderful woman. When we got married, she, first of all, she wanted to have a large family, but then she also saw things happening when, as we were getting students, as we said, from around the world, that these students and their families were coming sometimes, didn't have much money or whatever. They were married, they had small children. But she took it on herself to get to know them, invited them to parties here, as you know, and find out what she could do to help. She had you alongside in the parties, and she built a community, and that's what these students in this book, The Long Shadow, you find that they're always talking about those parties and how it bonded everybody together. And the thing that impressed me very much was when I heard a number of my former students giving a talk, like Jean-Claude Rogiers in particular. He would say, before I conclude, I want to say thank you to some people who've influenced me in my life, my graduate life, more than anyone. And he always said, Margaret and Charles Fairhurst. He never said me first. She was there. You know, they were coming to a strange land. They didn't know things and so on. But without your mother, we wouldn't have had the people to write in that Long Shadow what they write. And if you read that book, you'll see in it constant references to how, I remember another incident was just a while ago. thing about the German student, and your mother wasn't trained to cook or anything, you know, in first marriage. She did, always had a housekeeper and things. But we were in the house and we were having a party with some of the students, and it was just after we were married. And she made some brown bread. But when it came out of the oven, it hadn't risen. And it was like a solid rock, in my view. She said, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I've got this bread and it looks like this. So I said, you're all right. Just cut it as thin as you can, slice it and leave it there. I'll be all right. And I said, they'll eat it. They're great. They're students. They don't say anything about it. And Wolfgang Wawasek came to me, came to Margaret afterwards, and he, as you know, Wolfgang was a very precise, gentlemanly person, but he made longer polish. Mrs. Fairhurst, I hope you don't mind me asking you, please, but would you mind giving me the recipe for the brown bread? I have never tasted such excellent bread since I left Germany. And so we had to cough up after a while. But there were so many incidents like that, and they became close personal friends, and it's a wonderful experience. You know,
The career.
and you know that the thing I would love more than anything else right now is to be able to get up and go off in the car and drive Mother somewhere and just have dinner together.
So, Dad, thanks so much for sharing the stories about your career and everything with us. And I think it'll be very useful for future generations to hear your stories and your career.
Yeah, Dad, I'd just like to say thank you. I mean, career-wise, it's just amazing to have this record and for you to have taken that time. And your recollection to me is always amazing. I don't know that I know anybody else that can pull out acronyms and you know, just define them at any age the way you can. And you're in your 90s and non-Nigerian, I can't remember the right way. So career-wise, thank you. But on a personal note, as your daughter, and I'm sure Charles, it's just great to have this opportunity. I don't think there's many families that get to do this kind of a interview of their father or mother or parent. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you both, and thank you too for taking the time. It's something I didn't have an idea how it was going to go or what, and putting many different ideas, thinking about many. It made me reflect on a lot that I hadn't really given much thought to. And even though I'm 93, I'm still going to write a paper and still hope that somebody might read it to say that mining is essential. It's a worthwhile endeavor, and it faces uphill battles just to tell the truth. And I hope we will keep doing it, and I hope the young people will be influenced by that. It is, believe me, absolutely essential to the future civilization of the world. I remember listening to the astronauts from that took the pictures of Earthrise, the first picture ever seen of the Earth from outer space. And they said, we came up here to discover the moon, but we discovered more about Earth. So that's where we all have to be. We're all on this planet together. So our journey together has been wonderful, and you have both. You're the two who've been closest to it, although David, being with Petroleum, SPE, has also been in it. But I'm very proud of all of you. I think it's been a marvelous experience, and thank you both, and thank you from AIME, and thank you also to Nick Trivedi, whom I learned I'm not exactly sure by what route, but I learned that he was the one that proposed, and what I look forward to seeing. It's very high honor. Thank you all very much. Thank you too.